Okay, hello everyone. In this lecture, I want to talk about some of the festivals that were held in ancient Greece. And of course, you might want to start thinking about why you have festivals in the first place. I've given you a quote here from Plato, his book titled Laws, and it's in section 2.653. And it's really to pay honor to the gods. And if you want to read this quote, go ahead and stop the video. But it essentially says that people need a break from all of their work. And this is what a festival would do, of course, to pay honor to the gods. You also have Aristotle writing about um, when a festival would actually take place. And usually it was held after the gathering of the harvest because people would spend much of the year farming, then they would harvest everything, and then they'd have a bit of a break. And this was a good time to have a festival. There are a couple other reasons too why you have festivals. So you didn't have a standard calendar like we have today. And so these festivals would mark parts of the year, or what I've just called here markers for the calendar. It's also interesting too that festivals would bring lots of people together. Sometimes it would just be within the city-state itself. A lot of times too, and I mentioned this in the last lecture, where you'd have the Pan-Athenian festival. And again, pan means all. And so this would bring together Greeks from all over Greece, where they'd share a common language, religion, customs, values, and so on. And of course, another big reason to have a festival is that it really is an outlet for people. So they spent a good part of their year working in the fields, doing whatever their work is, and now they get a bit of a break to celebrate. Now, there are a couple of festivals I want to talk about. So I want to talk about one called Thesmophoria, the Festival of the Grape to the city Dionysius, the Festival of Athena, the Pan-Athenia, a festival called Thargelia, and I'm just going to spend just the briefest time on the Olympic festival, the athletic competition, because I think that's probably one that most people know about. Okay, Thesmophoria is a really interesting um, festival. It was really a women's only festival. And there's a story about Persephone and her brother Hermes, and then her mother Demeter. Now, part of this story was talking about how Persephone was wandering around the island of Sicily, and Hades got a glimpse of her and pulled her down into the afterworld or the underworld. Um, and Demeter could not find her daughter, looked all over. And Demeter is the goddess of weather. And so she got depressed, and so she didn't allow summer to come, and everything got really cold. The other gods are trying to figure out what was going on and realized Persephone, her daughter, was in the underworld with Hades. So Hades decided to let Persephone go up into the regular world, and he ended up giving her pomegranate seeds. And so those were the tie that made her come back for a bit of time every single year. And then Demeter was happy to see her daughter and allowed spring to come again, spring and summer, so that people could do a festival harvest. So part of Thesmophoria is about agriculture. And what you've got here is a picture of Persephone teaching a man named Triptolemus how to farm. And what she's doing is she's throwing down seeds, and she's got a digging stick where she will punch it into the ground, move it back a bit to make a hole, and pop the seeds in. So she's teaching him how to do a harvest. And here you've got Demeter and Persephone showing Triptolemus how to farm, or they're explaining to him how to farm. Now, Thesmophoria took place over a good part of a year. It's celebrated in fall, but it really started in spring. And the whole idea of Thesmophoria, again, is based on agriculture, which, of course, if people have lots of food to eat, they will have healthy children. So the idea is that you're honoring Persephone and Demeter in hopes that they will give healthy crops and, of course, healthy children. Now, in the spring, what they would do is they would go to what's called the caves of Demeter, and they would bring a number of different presents for the goddess. So some would bring cakes, they'd bring pottery piglets, and I've got a little slide here showing you that as a present. And sometimes they'd also take real piglets and throw them into the caves. And here's a pig rattle, so some idea of what this looked like for some of the women who went to the caves of Demeter to give their offerings. And then in the fall, really the fall, it was set up for a 3-day festival. And again, this is a women's only festival. So you've got tents or sleeping areas set up in an area called the Pinks, and I'll show you 2 slides of the Pinks in just a bit. It was just a big gathering spot. Day 1, the women went into a state of ritual purity, and what they ended up doing is walking to the caves of Demeter and digging up the material from the caves. Really what this is compost. That's really what it would be doing. Day 2, they would spend sitting or laying on the ground, and the idea behind this is that they're transferring their fertility into the ground. And they'd also do this interesting thing called astrologia. And what this really is the women would essentially curse each other. They would call each other names, swear at each other. The interesting thing about this, and you see this in other cultures, is that it actually reduces the tension among people once this day is over. And then on day 3, they take the material from the caves, they scatter it on the fields. And again, think of compost and how this is really helping the soil fertility. And then they have a banquet. Here's a slide showing you the Pinks. In the background, you can see the Acropolis here. And so this is a big gathering spot, and there's sort of a little platform here, and you can see just a close-up of the Pinks. So this is where the women would gather to celebrate this festival. Then you've got the festival of Dionysius, or the Dionysia. And Dionysius was the god of wine. I think that's probably the most famous part of what he was the god of. Fruit trees, vegetation. I mentioned this festival when I talked about Pisistratus. So it might have been something that he devised, or it's something that he made much, much larger. Really, the Festival of Dionysius is about music and plays. And our idea of like the theater and plays and musicals really comes from ancient Greece. I'll talk a little bit about this in just a second. This would start in March. And again, the calendar is an agricultural calendar. So sometimes it's in March, sometimes it's a little bit later. It usually starts with 3 things happening. So the pro-agon, agon just means contest, like almost like agony. What happens before the contest? You have a pomp, which is a procession. So you've heard of that word before, pomp and circumstance. So procession, and theatai is a group of spectators. This is where we get the word theater from. And of course, I just mentioned Dionysus. He's famous for being the god of wine. Here's a little image showing you how they actually made wine. So you've got someone stomping on the grapes in a basket, and then you've got the containers for wine. And then you've got Dionysus and a Maenad giving her some wine as well. Okay, so there were a number of steps that happened in this particular festival. And what's really interesting is you see parallels to festivals today. So 2 days before it actually started, they took the statue of Dionysus out of the temple and removed it. What they're going to do is they're going to clean it up and they're going to process through the town with it. And there are a lot of towns and villages in Europe that do the same thing with statues of Mary or statues of Christ, where they'll take it out of the church and then walk it through. So it's interesting, you've got a parallel like that. Now the pro-agon I just mentioned is something before the contest would start. Again, it's a big theater festival. So the playwrights would be announced, and then the playwrights would announce what plays they were going to be doing. Now, theater development was something that was happening in ancient Greece at the time. So that normally it would start off with one person doing what we would call a monologue. So one person speaking. And then it went to 2, a dialogue, and then it went to many people, and then they started including a chorus or someone with musical instruments. And here you've got the chorigos, or the choir master. I really like this one because this guy reminds me of someone from South Park. It looks like he got a South Park face. Anyway, then you have the procession of the pomp, where you've got the statue of Dionysus all cleaned off, brought back in a procession, taking back to the temple. You've got people carrying a number of different items in this procession. So some would carry the image of an erect penis. You've got wineskins, cattle, the first fruits of the year, and they would take these to the Theater of Dionysus, and I'll show you a slide of that in just a second. And then they had a procession that involved showing all the tribute that was paid to Athens. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but during this particular time when the festival was at its height, Athens was in charge of something called a Delian League. And again, I'll talk about this in a few weeks, where lots of city-states owed their tribute to Athens. And so this is a time when they showed off all the tribute they were receiving. So theate, theater spectators, which I mentioned, this is the Theater of Dionysus we're talking about. So here you've got the Acropolis here, and then you've got this theater here. And this is where many of the plays would happen. So this is just showing you the theater as it looks today. You've got this really interesting looking frieze or statues along the top. And then you've got people watching the plays. So tickets would be sold, people would go in. You'd have tragedies, which is the most common form of play during that period. You'd have 3 of those per day, and then you'd have comedies done on day 4 and 5. And then people would vote for which they really liked. Now, a lot of times women were not involved in these, and you've got men dressing up as women. This is a really interesting vase where you've got a man putting on his female attire. And then here's just another shot from a vase showing a play that was actually happening. And then I just mentioned on the last day, there'd be a vote for the best play and the best actor, which is interesting. You know, if you think about the Academy Awards, it's really the same thing. Okay, now on to the Festival of Athena. So this would happen in July. Now, there are a couple of different festivals for Athena. One was the Pan-Athenia. That happened every 4 years. And then you got the Athenia Festival. That happened on a much smaller scale, like a citywide festival. The Pan-Athenia, Greeks from all over could come into Athens and celebrate. Now, what you're looking at here is an image of the story of the birth of Athena. Now, she, according to the story, she was born fully formed with all of her armor out of the head of Zeus. And it's really interesting. There's a story about him having a massive headache, and he chopped the top of his head off to release the headache. And what came out was his daughter, Athena. You've got these really old Homeric hymns, and this one in particular is dedicated to Athena. And you can see that she is the namesake or the guardian of Athens. And it's really interesting. So, you know, the second sentence here is, dread is she, and with Ares she loves the deeds of war, the sack of cities and the shouting and the battle. What's really interesting, and I want you to really think about this, is that women in Athens did not fight. They were not involved in war, but here you've got a goddess who is really dedicated to war. And so I don't want to get off topic here, but there are some connections probably to the Minoans where they worshipped a goddess who had a lot of fighting tendencies. And it's thought that when the mainland Greeks invaded Mycenae, they might have taken some of that mythology back with them and then incorporated that into the daughter of Zeus. Anyway, up on the Acropolis, they built a temple to Athena, and this is the Parthenon, which is dedicated to the Virgin Athena. This statue is probably massive. We only have images of it, and some of the statues were replicas done by the Romans later on. So the statue is probably 36 feet tall. This is what it probably looked like within the Parthenon, so you can see the size of this massive statue. And then here's the image of the Parthenon. You've seen pictures of this before. But this is a temple dedicated to Athena. And then this is a shot from inside looking down. Okay, this was a fairly long festival. It would have all-night performances. You'd have sacrifices. There was an athletic competition to light the altar on the Acropolis. I mentioned with the Thesmophoria, it was a women's only festival. This one was for both men and women. And what they ended up doing when their procession, they would build a ship and they put something called a peplos on it. And this was a robe, and I'll show you a few slides of this robe. This is a robe that the women of the city would create or they would make. and then they would process it into the temple, and they would drape it over the statue of Athena, and then they'd have sacrifices. So this is just a shot of the Parthenon, showing some of the buildings that would be passed through as they were going on the procession. So I mentioned the procession. So at the very beginning, you would have the procession of just women, and they would be carrying the peplos, or the robe, or sort of something that would go over your shoulders, to drape over the statue of Athena. And this is part of something called the Parthenon frieze, which was carvings put into the top and the sides of the Parthenon. And then here's just another one. Here you can see a woman here, and she's handing the peplos to a smaller girl. You'd have sacrifices, and this one is not related to the festival to Athena, but it's just showing you sacrifices. And I showed you when we talked about the rites of passage, a man and a woman standing with a kylix, or a plate, or a container, making offerings. And then part of the procession also brought animals. And what you're seeing here are bulls being processed. And then, whoops, I can't go backwards on this. And then what they would do is they would sacrifice the bulls. So they would cut the throat, and then they'd have a banquet. And then they would process up into the temple to Athena and place the robe on her. And then you'd have athletic competitions. I had mentioned at the very beginning, there was an athletic race to see who could be the first to light a torch in the Parthenon. And again, think about the Olympics. We've got someone running at the very beginning. They've taken the light, and then they light the torch. So the same type of thing happening here. You'd have javelin throws as well. This is part of a vase showing the horses and the person on top of the horse throwing a javelin. And then there'd also be music competitions. So people would be playing their instruments, and then people would vote on the most popular ones. And then towards the end of May, which is still part of the Pandathenia, but it wasn't part of the very big festival, you'd have something called the Plantaria. And this was the cleaning of the temple. So in spring, this is when young girls would come in and clean the temple. They'd clean the statue. And there's something called the Calenteria, which is washing down the statue of Athena and maybe her cloak. Now, this was considered to be a very dangerous time, because they believed that Athena would leave the temple while this was happening. And of course, dangerous too, because as I mentioned, the statue is 36 feet tall. If you've got these small girls climbing up 36 feet, it's a dangerous time anyway. And more than likely, a few of them fell. But anyway, the idea is that Athena would leave the temple, they'd wash everything down, maybe put a clean peplos on her, and then she would come back into the temple. Then you've got the festival of Thargelia, which would happen in May. This is a really interesting festival. It's considered to be a scapegoat festival. So you might have, if you know any of the Bible, the Old Testament, there are stories about a black and a white goat, one being good and one being evil, and then they drive the evil one out. This is the same idea happening in ancient Athens. What they would do is on day one, they would choose two people to drive out of the city. And people would process, they would drive them out, and this is considered to be getting rid of the evil in the city. And then day two, they would have procession. So this is just one way of getting rid of the evil in Athens. And then again, I'm not going to spend really any time on talking about the Olympic Festival. These were athletic competitions held mostly by men, but women, as far as we know, definitely had their own Olympic festival. The first started in 776 BC, and the men and the women would have various athletic competitions. Like what you're seeing here is a wrestling competition, and they did all of these in the nude. People would become very famous after winning their competitions. It's almost like the modern Olympics today, where most people would know who the gold medalists are for whatever the sport is, and then they would usually become fairly wealthy. And I had mentioned at the very beginning of the first lecture that a lot of these vases we have were presents given to these men and women, and then they would be buried with them. And that's why we have so many in such good condition. Anyway, again, this is a sort of a quick and dirty look at festivals, and just to give you a better feel about what was happening in Greek culture during this time.